This gentleman, who's named Juan Lopez Mares, was a cristero during the revolution. He fought alongside a priest named Padre Aristeo Pedrosa, who actually left the priesthood and became a cristero soldier. So Father Pedrosa was a general, and Juan Lopez Mares fought alongside him. Juan Lopez Mares was about 17 years old. He and his brother fought alongside this priest, and for about 3 years had great success in the area of Los Altos de Jalisco, fighting the federal soldiers. All in all, I believe there were about 20,000 men who fought like Juan Lopez Mares during that time frame. They were supported by their families. They were also supported by the Joan of Arc Brigade, and that was a group of women who not necessarily picked up arms, but would support and supply all the other needs of the soldiers, whether it would be ammunition, running guns, providing food baskets, as well as helping the soldiers that were injured in terms of getting some medical assistance. And here's a photo of my father, Jose Munoz Navarro. In this photo, he was about 20 years old, but he was a younger child, actually, when the Cristero Revolution first took place. When my father told me about this revolution in Mexico, he was 81 years old, and that was in the year 2003. And my father was a very humble man. He had come to the United States when he was about 20 years old, worked in the railroads up north, north of Sacramento, and then finally settled down here in Ventura County in the late 40s, early 50s. He met and married my mom in the 50s. We were born right after that. And so frankly, his ties were more to the United States and Ventura County than to his hometown. But in 2003, just in a normal evening with my father, I started to ask questions about my grandparents. And it was in a very simple question about my grandmother. I wanted to know what she looked like. And I'm her namesake, so my middle name of Andrea was her first name. And all it took was just that question to then have my dad really just open up and tell me about the Cristero Revolution. And so my father was very instrumental in working alongside my grandfather and working the ranch of Rancho Las Cruces, but also having it be a very viable headquarters for Victoriano Ramirez and his Cristero soldiers during that time. My dad recalls helping my grandfather with the horses, as well as seeing martyrs hanging on trees. Those Cristero soldiers that didn't make it past that night of battle and perhaps were hung in order to cause others to perhaps stop fighting on behalf of the Catholic warriors, and cause some consternation among family members. When I asked my dad if he knew these men that he saw hanging on trees, my dad nodded his head and said yes, they were known men. They knew their faces, they knew who they were. And so it was really what my dad experienced was a story that was probably very difficult for him to share, but it really caused a very profound interest for me to find out more about the Cristero Revolution of Mexico. This is my grandmother, Andrea Navarro Cano. She was married to my grandfather, Juan Munoz Alvarez del Castillo. And Andrea Cano only lived to be about 34. She passed away when my dad was 11 years old, and my dad was the oldest of 7 kids. And it was really a question about her that led to the story of the Cristeros. Andrea was a young mother, and who was married to my grandfather, who was probably a few years older than her when the whole Cristero Revolution broke out. And when they were younger, they weren't really affected by the Mexican Revolution, but this Cristero War in the late 1920s really took its toll on the family. And she not only then made her home for 7 kids, but also then the soldiers that came alongside and fought with Victoriano El 14 Ramirez. And this then is my mother, Herminia Basulto Rivera. And her story during this time is not so much about the Cristero soldiers, but it is more about being a young girl growing up in the city known as Ocotlan, Jalisco, Mexico. My mother comes from a long line of people involved in politics and those that are involved with the government of Mexico. And during the time frame of my dad telling me the story about the Cristero Revolution, my mom didn't even know his story. My mom and dad were married over almost 50 years before my dad passed away in 2003. And so for my mom, it was a story of, really not even knowing my dad's background as he was a young kid. But during that time, she was able then to reflect back on how young she was when the Cristero Revolution took place. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because my mom was raised on the other side of the Cristero Revolution. She was raised on the side of a clandestine Catholic family who couldn't really have ties to the Catholic Church, but were more tied into the government forces and the federales of that time frame. So you'll have to stay tuned and read my book, Abandoned Angels, to find more about what the family went through on both sides of the war.